This photo of 3 children seems innocent, until experts uncover a hidden truth. The antique shop in Charleston smelled of old wood and mothballs. Marcus Williams had been browsing estate sale items for over an hour when he noticed the small daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame, half hidden behind a stack of depression glass. As a researcher for the Equal Justice Initiative documenting the legacy of slavery in America, Marcus had trained himself to look for images that told stories beyond their surfaces. This photograph stopped him cold. 3 children, probably between 8 and 10 years old, sat together on an ornate garden bench. 2 white children, a boy and a girl with blonde ringlets, flanked a black child in the center. All 3 wore expensive clothing. The white boy in a tailored suit with a bow tie, the girl in an elaborate dress with lace trim, and the black child in equally fine clothes, a pressed white shirt, dark vest, and trousers that matched the white boy's. The 3 children were smiling. Genuine smiles, not the rigid formality typical of 1850s photography. Their bodies were close, comfortable with each other. The white girl had her hand resting on the black child's shoulder. The white boy leaned in slightly, as if they'd been laughing just before the photographer captured the moment. At first glance, it appeared to be a touching testament to childhood friendship, transcending the racial barriers of antebellum South Carolina. The kind of image that suggested innocence, that perhaps children of that era saw beyond the prejudices of their parents. But Marcus had learned never to accept such images at face value. He picked up the frame, studying it under the shop's dim lighting. The photograph was dated on the back in faded ink, Summer 1854, Charleston. A photographer's stamp read Whitmore Studios. Marcus examined each child's face carefully. The white children looked relaxed, happy. But the black child's smile, Marcus noticed, didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something else there, something harder to define. Wariness, perhaps, or fear masked by the performance of happiness. And then Marcus saw it. The black child's sleeves had ridden up slightly on both arms. Around each wrist, barely visible in the photograph's sepia tones, were marks, discolored bands of skin that suggested long-term abrasion. Marcus had seen similar marks in other historical photographs and documents. They were the unmistakable evidence of shackles worn for extended periods. Marcus's hands began to shake. This wasn't a photograph of 3 friends playing together. This was something far darker. A carefully staged image that documented a horror even as it tried to present an illusion of harmony and care. He purchased the photograph for $30 and walked directly to his car. Sitting in the parking lot, he examined the image again under better light, using his phone's camera to zoom in on details. The marks on the wrists were definite. And now that he was looking more carefully, he noticed other things. The black child sat slightly forward on the bench, as if ready to stand at a moment's notice. His posture, despite the smile, was deferential, and his clothing, while expensive, was slightly too large. Handed down, perhaps, or purchased without careful fitting. This child was enslaved. Marcus was certain of it. Dressed in fine clothes and posed with his enslaver's children as if they were equals, but marked by the chains that defined his actual status. Marcus needed to know who these children were, what had happened to them, and why someone had staged this particular photograph. He started his car and headed back to his office in Montgomery, Alabama, already planning the research that would consume the next months of his life. Back at the Equal Justice Initiative's research center, Marcus set up the daguerreotype under high-intensity lights and photographed it from every angle. The digital images revealed details invisible in casual viewing. The marks on the black child's wrists were even more apparent under magnification. Bands of lighter skin approximately an inch wide on each wrist, with subtle scarring visible along the edges. Marcus had documented similar injuries in his research. Enslaved children who were shackled, whether as punishment to prevent escape or simply as a demonstration of power, developed these characteristic marks. The skin would lighten where metal pressed constantly against flesh, and scar tissue would form where the shackles rubbed during movement or struggle. He began with the photographer's mark, Whitmore Studios, Charleston, 1854. Historical directories showed that Edward Whitmore had operated a successful photography business in Charleston from 1851 to 1863, catering to wealthy families who could afford the expensive daguerreotype process. Whitmore had advertised family portraits of distinction and children's likenesses captured with artistic sensitivity. Marcus found dozens of examples of Whitmore's work in archives and museum collections. The photographer had a distinctive style, outdoor settings when possible, natural poses, attention to clothing and background details that signaled his subject's wealth and status. Many of his portraits included enslaved servants in the background, positioned to demonstrate the family's prosperity. But this photograph was different. The enslaved child wasn't in the background. He was centered, positioned between the white children, dressed as finely as they were. This wasn't about displaying wealth through the number of servants. This was something else. Marcus contacted colleagues at the Charleston Museum and the South Carolina Historical Society, sending them high-resolution images of the photograph. Within 2 days, he had a response from Dr. Patricia Green, a historian specializing in antebellum Charleston families. "I believe I've identified the white children," Patricia's email began. The clothing style and the Whitmore Studios connection led me to prominent Charleston families from 1854. I found a matching photograph in our collection, a formal family portrait taken the same year showing the Hartwell family, Colonel James Hartwell, his wife Eleanor, and their two children, William and Charlotte. The children in your photograph match William and Charlotte Hartwell perfectly. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The Hartwell family, he knew that name. Colonel James Hartwell had been one of Charleston's wealthiest plantation owners, with properties totaling over 2,000 acres, and, according to the 1850 census slave schedule, ownership of 187 enslaved people. But here's what's interesting, Patricia's email continued. I found a reference to this specific photograph in Eleanor Hartwell's diary, which was donated to our archives in the 1920s. She mentions commissioning Whitmore to photograph the children at play with their little companion. She doesn't name the black child, but she refers to him as always with them, and notes that William and Charlotte were quite attached to the boy. There's something unsettling about the casual way she discusses this, as if it's completely normal for her children to play with an enslaved child while that child wore shackles. Marcus requested copies of Eleanor Hartwell's complete diary. When the scanned pages arrived, he spent 2 days reading through entries from 1852 to 1856, searching for any mention of the black child in the photograph. Eleanor wrote about her children frequently, their lessons, their health, their social development, and she mentioned the boy in dozens of entries, always without using his name. Eleanor Hartwell's diary painted a disturbing picture of how enslaved children existed in the lives of wealthy white families, simultaneously present and invisible, valued and utterly disposable. Marcus compiled every reference to the boy who appeared in the photograph with William and Charlotte. March 1853. William has become quite attached to the boy from the quarters. James says it's natural for children to play together, and the boy is well behaved and clean. I've instructed Mammy to ensure he's properly dressed when he comes to the house. July 1853. Charlotte insists the boy join her lessons. I've allowed it, though of course he cannot learn to read or write. That would be illegal and dangerous. But he sits quietly while she practices her letters, and his presence seems to motivate her studiousness. December 1853. The boy attempted to run away last week. James was quite disappointed. We'd treated him well, allowed him privileges unusual for his station. James had him punished appropriately and fitted with restraints to prevent future incidents. The children were upset by the sight of it, so I've explained that discipline, while unpleasant, is necessary for the boy's own good and for the safety of our family. Marcus felt sick reading these entries. The restraints Eleanor mentioned so casually were the shackles that had left marks on the child's wrists, marks still visible in the photograph taken 6 months later. January 1854. The boy has adjusted to his restraints. He no longer struggles against them and has resumed his usual cheerful manner with the children. William asked why the boy must wear chains when he and Charlotte do not. I've explained that different rules apply to different people and that the boy's restraints are like a parent's loving guidance. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but necessary for proper development. Marcus stopped reading, his hands clenched into fists. The psychological manipulation was staggering, teaching the enslaved child that his shackles were a form of care, teaching the white children that some people deserved chains while others deserved freedom based solely on the color of their skin. But Eleanor never once wrote the enslaved child's name. In dozens of diary entries spanning years, he was always the boy or their little companion. This erasure was deliberate. Enslaved people weren't individuals with names and identities. They were property, described by function rather than personhood. Marcus needed to find the child's name. He requested the Hartwell plantation records from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Plantation ledgers often listed enslaved people by name, age, and assigned work. If the child had been part of the Hartwell holdings, there would be a record. The ledgers arrived as digital scans, heavy leather-bound books filled with meticulous handwriting documenting the buying, selling, births, deaths, and labor assignments of human beings treated as livestock. Marcus forced himself to read through the dehumanizing language, searching for any child who might match the boy in the photograph. In the 1854 ledger, under House Servants' Children, he found an entry that made his breath catch. Samuel, male, approximately 9 years, assigned to children's companion and light household duties. Mother, Rose, deceased 1852. Father, unknown. Note, flight risk, secured as of December 1853. Samuel, the boy finally had a name. Marcus traced Samuel's presence in the Hartwell records backward and forward from 1854. The documentation was sparse but devastating. Samuel had been born on the Hartwell plantation around 1845. His mother Rose had worked as a house servant until her death in 1852. The cause listed simply as fever, though Marcus knew that term covered everything from cholera to exhaustion to violence. After Rose's death, 7-year-old Samuel had been assigned to work in the main house. The 1853 ledger noted, Samuel shows intelligence and obedience. Assigned to attend Master William and Miss Charlotte, to assist with their needs and provide companionship, well suited for this duty. The language was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. Samuel hadn't been invited to be the children's friend. He had been assigned to them, his companionship a form of labor, his entire existence structured around serving white children barely older than himself. The December 1853 entry about Samuel's attempted escape appeared in the plantation ledger as well. Samuel apprehended 2 miles from property attempting flight. 15 lashes administered, fitted with wrist restraints to prevent future attempts. Restraints to remain until trustworthiness demonstrated. 15 lashes. Samuel had been 8 years old. Marcus found more references to Samuel through 1854 and 1850. The restraints remained on his wrists for at least 18 months, long enough to leave the permanent scarring visible in the photograph. During this time, he continued to serve as William and Charlotte's companion, playing with them, attending their lessons, accompanying them on walks around the plantation grounds. The photograph from summer 1854 had been taken about 6 months after Samuel's escape attempt. Marcus studied the image again with this new knowledge. Samuel's smile now seemed even more clearly forced, the performance of a child who had learned that appearing cheerful was necessary for survival, that showing the pain and terror he surely felt would result in more punishment. The white children's casual affection, Charlotte's hand on Samuel's shoulder, William's comfortable proximity, took on a different meaning as well. They likely did feel genuine fondness for Samuel. Children that age form real attachments. But their affection existed entirely within a power structure where they owned Samuel, where their father could have him whipped or shackled or sold at any moment, where Samuel's needs and feelings and personhood were irrelevant compared to their comfort and entertainment. In 1856, the ledger entries about Samuel changed tone. Samuel, age 11, becoming unsuitable for house service, shows increasing sullenness and resistance to instruction, recommend reassignment to field work. Marcus knew what this meant. As Samuel grew older, as the trauma of his enslavement deepened, maintaining the performance of cheerful companionship became impossible. The Hartwells interpreted his natural human response to trauma as sullenness and resistance. The final entry about Samuel appeared in October 1856. Samuel sold to Mr. Thomas Crawford, plantation owner from Mississippi, for $650. Proceeds recorded. Samuel had been 11 years old. He'd been sold away from the only home he'd known, from the graves of his mother and any other family, sent to Mississippi alone. The ledger recorded this transaction with the same clinical detachment used for selling furniture or livestock. Marcus searched Mississippi plantation records, trying to trace Samuel further, but the trail went cold. Enslaved people sold out of state were notoriously difficult to track. Deliberately so, as separation was used as punishment and as a tool to prevent family bonds from forming. Samuel disappeared into the historical void that had swallowed millions of enslaved people whose names, stories, and fates were never recorded or were recorded only as property transactions. While Samuel's trail vanished, Marcus could easily trace what happened to William and Charlotte Hartwell. Their lives were documented in newspapers, society announcements, wills, and family histories preserved by descendants proud of their heritage. William Hartwell had grown up to attend the College of Charleston, then managed his father's plantation operations until the Civil War. He'd served as an officer in the Confederate Army and returned home after the war to find the family's wealth greatly diminished but not destroyed. He'd rebuilt the plantation's prosperity using exploitative labor contracts with freed black workers, a system that replicated many aspects of slavery under different legal structures. William had married, had 5 children, and died in 1903 at age 53, remembered in his obituary as a pillar of Charleston society and a guardian of Southern heritage. Charlotte had married at 18 into another wealthy plantation family. She'd been known for her charity work. Ironically, much of it focused on uplifting the black community through organizations that taught subservience and compliance. She'd lived until 1911, dying at age 65, her obituary praising her as a lady of refinement and Christian virtue. Neither William nor Charlotte, in any of their letters, diaries, or public statements preserved in archives, ever mentioned Samuel, the boy who had been their constant companion for years, who appeared in photographs with them, who had played with them daily while wearing shackles. He'd been completely erased from their memory, or at least from any record they left behind. Marcus found one exception, a letter William had written to his father in 1857, a year after Samuel was sold away. William, then 13, was at boarding school and wrote, "I sometimes think of the boy who used to attend me when I was younger. I wonder if he fared well in his new situation. Mother wrote that you'd sold him to a Mississippi planter. I hope he's treated kindly there." The casual tone of the letter was staggering. Samuel's sale and separation, a trauma that likely destroyed whatever remained of Samuel's childhood, was reduced to idle wondering about whether he'd fared well, as if he'd simply changed employment rather than been sold like livestock and sent away from everything he knew. Marcus discovered that the Hartwell family home still stood in Charleston, now divided into expensive condominiums. The plantation land had been sold off piece by piece over the decades, but the main house and about 10 acres remained, meticulously preserved as an example of antebellum architecture. He also found that the Hartwell family maintained an active historical society, preserving family documents and promoting their ancestors' legacy. Their website featured dozens of photographs from the family's history, including formal portraits of James and Eleanor Hartwell and later images of William and Charlotte as adults. But the 1854 photograph of the three children wasn't among the family's preserved images. Someone at some point had chosen not to include it in the official family history, perhaps because Samuel's presence and the visible shackle marks made the image uncomfortable, a reminder of realities the family preferred to forget. Marcus needed to confront this history publicly, to ensure Samuel wasn't erased again. He began planning an exhibition. 6 months after finding the photograph, Marcus stood in the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, preparing for the opening of a new permanent exhibition, Childhood Under Slavery, The Hidden Truth in Family Photographs. The 1854 image of William, Charlotte, and Samuel was the centerpiece. Marcus had worked with conservators to create a large-scale reproduction that revealed every detail, including digital enhancement that made the shackle marks on Samuel's wrists unmistakably clear. Beside the photograph hung text panels explaining what viewers were seeing. This photograph was staged to present an image of innocent childhood friendship, the main panel read. The three children are dressed in expensive clothing and posed together as apparent equals. But look closely at the wrists of the black child. The marks you see are scarring from shackles, metal restraints this 8-year-old boy was forced to wear after attempting to escape slavery. This child, whose name was Samuel, wasn't playing with the white children by choice. He was assigned to them as property, forced to perform companionship while enduring violence and captivity. The exhibition included Eleanor Hartwell's diary entries, displayed alongside documentation of Samuel's attempted escape, his punishment, and his eventual sale to Mississippi. Interactive displays allowed visitors to explore the full context: the Hartwell family's wealth built on enslaved labor, the legal system that allowed children to be shackled and sold, the deliberate erasure of enslaved people's names and identities from historical records. Marcus had also created a section exploring what happened to the three children as they aged. Visitors could see photographs of William and Charlotte as adults, read their obituaries, and learn about their prosperous, respected lives. Then they encountered a simple panel with Samuel's name and dates. Samuel, born approximately 1845, sold away from South Carolina in 1856. Further fate unknown. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Two children whose entire lives were documented and celebrated. One child who vanished into historical silence. The exhibition's opening drew significant media coverage. Major newspapers ran features. NPR conducted an interview. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the exhibition opened, Marcus received an email from a woman named Grace Morrison in Jackson, Mississippi. The subject line read, "I think I'm descended from the boy in your photograph." Marcus's hands shook as he opened the message. "My great-great-great-grandfather was a man named Samuel Rose," Grace wrote. Family oral history says he was born enslaved in South Carolina around 1845 and was sold to Mississippi as a child. After emancipation, he took his mother's name, Rose, as his surname. He lived until 1923 and told his children and grandchildren about his time in Charleston, about being forced to serve as a companion to white children while wearing chains. He specifically mentioned being photographed with those children. "My family has preserved his story for generations. When I saw the news coverage of your exhibition, I recognized his story immediately." Marcus and Grace spoke by phone for 2 hours that evening. She was 63 years old, a retired schoolteacher and the keeper of her family's oral history, stories passed down through 5 generations from Samuel himself. He was traumatized by those years in Charleston, Grace explained. He told his daughter, my great-great-grandmother, that the worst part wasn't the physical violence, though that was terrible. The worst part was being forced to pretend he loved his captors. Being forced to smile and play and act cheerful with children who owned him, who could have him beaten or sold at any moment. He said it made him feel like he was betraying himself, erasing his own humanity to perform for white people's comfort. Samuel had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi in 1856, just as the Hartwell records indicated. The plantation owner, Thomas Crawford, had worked Samuel in the fields until the Civil War. After emancipation, Samuel had stayed in Mississippi, working as a sharecropper and then as a laborer on the railroads. He'd married, had 6 children, and lived to age 78. He was bitter, Grace said quietly. My great-great-grandmother said he rarely smiled in his adult life. The performance of happiness he'd been forced to maintain as a child had permanently damaged his ability to express genuine joy. He told his children that white people had stolen his childhood twice, once by enslaving him and again by forcing him to pretend enslavement was acceptable, even pleasant. Grace had photographs of Samuel from later in his life. She sent them to Marcus via email. The images showed an elderly black man with a stern, weathered face, deep lines around his mouth, eyes that held decades of accumulated pain. In every photograph, his hands were carefully positioned to show his wrists, and the scars that still marked them 60 years after the shackles had been removed. He insisted on that, Grace explained. Whenever someone took his photograph, he made sure his wrist scars were visible. He said they were proof of what had been done to him, proof that couldn't be erased or denied. He wanted evidence to survive. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. Samuel had understood something profound, that photographs could be used to erase truth as the 1854 image had attempted to do by presenting slavery as benign and enslavers as kind. But photographs could also preserve truth if the subjects insisted on making their reality visible. Samuel's adult portraits, with their deliberate display of his scars, were a testimony that countered the lie of the childhood photograph. Grace had more to share. Samuel talked about those white children specifically. He said the girl, Charlotte, used to cry when he was punished. She'd beg her parents not to hurt him, but she never tried to actually help him escape or opposed slavery itself. She just didn't want to witness the violence that maintained the system she benefited from. Samuel said that kind of selective sympathy was almost worse than outright cruelty. It made white people feel virtuous while doing nothing to change the conditions that caused suffering. Grace had preserved other family stories too. Samuel had tried to find his extended family after emancipation, but discovered that most had been sold away from the Hartwell plantation before the war. He'd spent decades searching for siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles, placing advertisements in black newspapers, writing letters to churches and aid societies. He'd found a few distant relatives, but never reconnected with his immediate family. Slavery had scattered them so thoroughly that the bonds couldn't be reestablished. "The Hartwell family destroyed my family," Grace said, her voice breaking. "They didn't just enslave my ancestors. They deliberately separated them, sold them away from each other, erased their connections and histories. And then they preserved their own family's history meticulously, celebrating themselves as genteel Southerners while trying to erase every trace of the people they'd brutalized." Marcus knew what had to happen next. Grace's family story needed to be part of the exhibition, needed to be told alongside the photograph so viewers understood that the nameless child in the image had a life, a future, descendants who carried his story forward. News of the exhibition and Grace's connection to Samuel reached Charleston, and the response from the Hartwell family was swift and defensive. A woman named Catherine Hartwell Bennett, William's great-great-granddaughter, sent Marcus a lengthy email that he found both predictable and infuriating. "While we acknowledge our family's complicated history," Catherine wrote, "we believe your exhibition presents an unbalanced and anachronistic view of the past. The Hartwell family provided housing, food, and care for the enslaved people on their property, including the child in the photograph. Our ancestors were products of their time, operating within legal and social systems they didn't create. To judge them by modern standards is unfair and harmful to our family's legacy." The letter continued, arguing that the photograph actually demonstrated the Hartwell family's kindness, that they'd allowed Samuel to dress well, receive education alongside their children, and be photographed as if he were their equal. Catherine suggested that the shackles Marcus had identified might have been exaggerated or misinterpreted, that perhaps they were some other kind of mark or photographic artifact. Marcus responded with a detailed email including high-resolution images of Samuel's wrist scars, Eleanor Hartwell's own diary entries describing Samuel's restraints, and plantation records documenting his punishment and sale. He also included Grace's contact information and suggested Catherine might want to hear directly from Samuel's descendants about the impact of her ancestors' kindness. Catherine never replied to that email, but she did post a statement on the Hartwell Family Historical Society's website expressing disappointment that certain activists were using historical photographs to shame and attack families rather than promoting reconciliation and understanding. The statement provoked strong responses online. Historians pointed out that acknowledging historical atrocities wasn't an attack. It was truth-telling necessary for genuine understanding. Activists noted that the Hartwell family's desire for reconciliation required no accountability or acknowledgement of harm, just a request that descendants of enslaved people stop bringing up uncomfortable facts. The controversy drove more visitors to the exhibition. News outlets covered the dispute, and the photograph of Samuel with William and Charlotte became widely recognized, not as a charming image of childhood innocence, but as documentary evidence of slavery's psychological cruelty and the lengths enslavers would go to normalize and disguise their violence. Marcus arranged for Grace to fly to Montgomery. He wanted her to see the exhibition, to stand before the photograph of her ancestor and know that his story was being told, his name was being said, his survival and resistance were being honored. When Grace walked into the exhibition space and saw the large-scale reproduction of the 1854 photograph, she stopped and began to weep. Marcus stood beside her silently, giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. "He's so young," Grace whispered finally. "I've always known the story, but seeing his face, seeing how small he was, seeing those marks on his wrists, it's different. He was just a baby, and they tortured him. They bought and sold him like furniture. They erased his name and his mother's memory and his entire humanity." She reached out and touched the image of Samuel's face, her fingers trembling. "But he survived. He lived. He had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we're still here. We remember him. They tried to erase him, but he's more permanent than all their monuments and mansions. His truth outlasted their lies." Marcus spent the following months expanding his research, looking for other photographs that might document enslaved children in similar situations. What he found was a pattern, dozens of images from the 1840s through 1860s showing white children posed with enslaved children, often dressed similarly, positioned to suggest friendship or equality. These photographs served a specific propaganda purpose, he realized. They were created to counter abolitionist claims that slavery was cruel and dehumanizing. Enslavers commissioned photographs showing enslaved children well-dressed and apparently happy. Proof that slavery was benign, that enslaved people were treated as family members, that the anti-slavery movement was exaggerating conditions in the South. But when Marcus examined these images closely, especially high-resolution digital copies that revealed details invisible in the original prints, he found evidence contradicting the intended message. Enslaved children's bodies often showed signs of malnutrition, injury, or stress. Their postures demonstrated wariness and tension. And in some cases, like Samuel's photograph, the physical evidence of violence was literally visible on their bodies. Marcus partnered with other researchers to create a database of these photographs, documenting when and where they were taken, identifying both the enslavers' families and, when possible, the enslaved individuals. They worked with genealogists and descendants of enslaved people to trace names and stories, pulling people back from historical erasure. Grace became involved in this work, helping to connect researchers with other families who carried oral histories about enslaved ancestors. Through this network, Marcus discovered 2 more photographs containing images of Samuel, both taken at the Hartwell plantation before his 1856 sale. One showed him at about age 7, standing behind Eleanor Hartwell in a formal family portrait. He wore shabby clothes and stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his expression blank. This was before his attempted escape, before the shackles, and his body language showed the trained subservience of a child already well acquainted with violence. The second photograph was taken in 1855, about a year after the garden bench image. Samuel stood alone in this one, photographed against the wall of a plantation outbuilding. He was dressed in the same kind of fine clothing as before, but his wrists were clearly visible, the shackles still in place a year after his escape attempt. His face held no smile, just a direct haunted stare at the camera. Grace wept when Marcus showed her these images. They documented everything they did to him, she said. They photographed him in chains and didn't even see how it contradicted the story they were trying to tell. They were so convinced of their own righteousness that they couldn't see the truth their own photographs preserved. Marcus included all 3 photographs of Samuel in an expanded exhibition. He arranged them chronologically, showing Samuel's transformation from a wary but unrestrained 7-year-old to a shackled 8-year-old forced to perform happiness to an 11-year-old, whose face showed the accumulated trauma of years of captivity. The exhibition also included the photographs from Samuel's adult life, the elderly man he'd become, deliberately displaying his scars, refusing to let viewers look away from what had been done to him. These photographs tell 2 stories, Marcus wrote in the exhibition text. The story enslavers wanted to tell, that slavery was benign and enslaved people were content, and the truth that photographs couldn't fully hide, that slavery was violence, that it damaged every person it touched, and that the survivors carried its marks for their entire lives. 1 year after Marcus found the photograph, the Equal Justice Initiative organized a memorial service for Samuel Rose. It was held in Charleston, in a park that had once been part of the Hartwell Plantations land. Over 200 people attended. Historians, activists, descendants of enslaved people, and even a few descendants of enslavers willing to acknowledge their families' histories honestly. Grace spoke, reading from a statement her family had prepared together. Samuel Rose was born into slavery around 1845. He was forced to labor from the moment he could walk. He was shackled as a child for the crime of seeking freedom. He was sold away from his home at age 11 and never saw South Carolina again. He survived the Civil War, Emancipation, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. He lived 78 years despite a system designed to destroy him, and he made sure his descendants would know his story, would remember his name, would understand what had been done to him and what he had survived. For 140 years, the photograph of Samuel with William and Charlotte Hartwell was interpreted as a charming image of childhood innocence. Our family knew the truth, that Samuel had been in chains while that photograph was taken, that his smile was coerced, that every moment of his childhood with the Hartwells was defined by violence and captivity. But no one listened to our oral history. It took a researcher noticing the scars on Samuel's wrists for the truth to finally be acknowledged. This is why we must preserve these difficult histories. This is why we must look closely at historical images that seem innocent and ask whose stories are being erased. This is why we must believe descendants of enslaved people when they tell us their family histories, even when those histories contradict comfortable narratives about the past. Samuel Rose existed. He mattered. He was a person, not property. He had a mother who loved him, a life that extended far beyond his years of enslavement, and descendants who carry his memory forward. The Hartwell family tried to erase him. They never used his name in their records. They sold him away. They celebrated their own history while denying his humanity. But he survived. We survived. And we're here today to say his name, to honor his life, and to ensure he's never forgotten again. Marcus unveiled a memorial marker that would be installed in the park. It was simple. Black granite engraved with Samuel's name, dates, and a brief inscription. Enslaved as a child on this land. Shackled, sold, but not broken. Remembered by those who carry his story forward. Below the inscription was a reproduction of the 1854 photograph, the 3 children on the garden bench. But unlike the original photograph, which had tried to hide the truth, This reproduction included arrows pointing to Samuel's wrists and text that read, "The marks you see are scars from shackles. This child was enslaved. His name was Samuel Rose." After the ceremony, Marcus stood with Grace looking at the memorial. The land around them had changed dramatically since Samuel's childhood. The plantation buildings were gone, replaced by suburban development in this small park. But the history remained, marked now in a way that couldn't be ignored. "Do you think he would be satisfied with this?" Marcus asked quietly. With the memorial, the exhibition, his story finally being told? Grace considered the question carefully. Samuel lived his entire adult life fighting to be seen as fully human, to have his experiences acknowledged. He faced people who denied slavery had been cruel, who insisted enslaved people had been content, who erased and minimized and justified the violence done to him. This memorial does what he spent his life trying to do. It insists on the truth. It names him. It acknowledges what was done to him. So yes, I think he would find some peace in this. She paused, looking at the photograph on the memorial. 8-year-old Samuel with shackle scars on his wrists, forced to smile for the camera. But I also think he'd want people to understand that remembering isn't enough. These histories aren't just past. They created systems and inequalities that persist today. Samuel's story matters not just because he suffered, but because understanding how slavery worked, how it was disguised and justified, how it damaged generations of black families, is essential to addressing its ongoing legacy. Marcus nodded, thinking about all the work still to be done, the thousands of photographs yet to be examined closely, the millions of enslaved people whose names had been erased, the descendant communities still fighting for acknowledgement and justice. But today, in this moment, Samuel Rose was remembered. His face looked out from the memorial, no longer forced to smile, no longer erased, no longer silent. The photograph that had been created to hide the truth of slavery had become, through careful attention and the persistent voice of his descendants, testimony to that truth. Samuel had reached across 170 years through the image preserved in silver and glass. His scars, visible to anyone who looked closely enough, had finally told their story, and that story had changed everything.